Hi, I'm Meg Hubeck, and I'm the Director of Instruction at the UVA Center for Politics. We are having lunch with James Madison, 4th President of the United States, just following the War of 1812 and upon his retirement to Montpelier with his wife Dolly. Today we are having lunch in Pavilion 4, the home of Center for Politics Director Larry Sabato. We welcome you to engage in this delightful conversation about challenges to the Constitution in its early years. Thank you again for using the Youth Leadership Initiative.
My name is Jack Strickland. I go to Kate Collins Middle School and I'm going into 7th grade.
My name is Gabe Cram. I go to Kate Collins Middle School and I'm going into 7th grade.
I'm Serenity Stacy. I go to Kate Collins Middle School and I'm going into 7th grade.
My name is Edie Ayton. I go to Buford Middle School and I'm going into 8th grade.
My name is Alice Taylor. I go to Henley Middle School and I'm going to 8th grade.
My name is Lucy Taylor. I'm at Western Albemarle High School and I'm going to be a senior.
My name is Isabel Pardue. I go to Jack Jewett Middle School and I'm going into 8th grade.
Perhaps you might like to start?
Oh, yes, sir.
And your name, sir, is?
My name is Mr. Strickland.
Mr. Strickland.
I have a question for you, Mr. Madison. In the light of recent constitutional challenges, what is your view on Patrick Henry? Was he right or not correct to show concern about the Constitution?
I met with Mr. Henry in 1784 and 85 and determined from him that he was as anxious about the course of events under the Articles of Confederation and whether the Union could stay intact and whether more force and energy would be requisite to this new national government proposed in 1787 to be proposed. Mr. Henry seemed to indicate he was in favor of such measures to strengthen the Articles. But when it came time to discuss particulars of a new government and a new strength to the Articles of Confederation, Mr. Henry shied on matters of taxation. Mr. Henry was very forceful. He's quite an orator. He was a host unto himself in a way, and cast vitriol on the subjects of the Constitution. We were supposed to debate it on an article by article nature in that convention, but he was very insistent on in wending his way through all parts of the proposed Constitution in levying his objections to it. And I was rather surprised at the vehemence which he exhibited during that time. Mr. Henry harbored a high regard for personal rights. In that context, I believe his objections to the Constitution were unwarranted. I say this not to degrade Mr. Henry, but to merely comment upon the course of events and the necessary steps to be taken to strengthen the Union, to perpetuate and cherish and preserve the Union of the States. And the new Constitution was going to accomplish that more effectively than the Articles of Confederation, which Mr. Henry advocated.
Mr. President, my name is Ms. Taylor. Along those same lines, how did you see the tendencies of those who had been opposed to the creation of the Constitution, maybe those who were more loyal to state governments than the national government? How did that affect the War of 1812, if it did?
Ours is a new experiment in Republican government, and the nation had not, since 1789, since the inception of the new Constitution, had not actually declared war at all. The difficulties with the Barbary states in the early 1801 to 1805, the difficulties with the quasi-war with the French in the late 1790s, were not hostile actions that predicated a declaration of war by the Congress. The war that started in June of 1812 was such a declaration of war to be done, and in so seeking a declaration of war, it was necessary to secure the Congress to declare the war. I might have advocated the Congress to declare war, but it should be remembered that in all such instances, the executive branch is the most likely to advocate war, and so it should not be vested. Those who are conducting the war, continuing the war, concluding the war, should not be the same ones who initiate the war. And there should be a separate body of individuals, and that is levied in the Congress. So that the Congress, in voting for war in June of 1812, both in the House on June 4th and in the Senate on June 17th, represented the people at large through the representatives in the Senate and the House of Representatives. It was not a unanimous decision, to be sure. Indeed, the divisions in the House vote and in the Senate vote indicated that there were still sentiments of opposition to the war being declared. This is reflected not only in the politics of the Congress, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans, or just the Republicans as we call them. There were divisions in the Republican Party as well about whether war should be declared and how it should be conducted and what should be done. There are divisions in the nation. There is an attachment to the New England states, what we call the northeastern states, attachment to England, and a general suspicion, equally vehement, about the nature of France and Napoleon's conduct in France. And these matters bring out sectional differences in the country, not just political, but also sectional. And then there are merchants, there are lawyers who are paid to disagree with one another. They all are represented in the Congress, and you all may very well believe that will be subjected to objections in the Congress because of these different conflicts that arise in the nation. And in answer to your question, I believe the politics of the day, the sections of the country, the commercial interest. There are many commercial interests in Virginia and North Carolina who vend articles to other nations. The conduct of the war, the declaration of war, would preclude them being able to trade as actively as they used to. So they all have different ventures, they all have different interests, and then these commingle when the government decides to declare war in the Senate. And it's a reflection of all these varying components that make the politics of the day very interesting and hardly unanimous, certainly in the last 3 years, of support for or adversaries against the war.
Mr. President, my name is Miss Aiden, and in the past few minutes you have constantly been mentioning opposition to the war, and I know that one party who was opposing the war was the Federalist Party, and they met at the Hartford, a secret convention called the Hartford Convention in December of 1814, and they made a list of 7 amendments that they wanted to add to the Constitution. How do you think those amendments would have changed the Constitution if they were to be added to the Constitution?
Well, at first, I must say that the opposition in New England to the war was vehement in some circles, but moderate in others. The convention came about after a very unfortunate year in 1814. It suffered a great number of losses. The nation was in peril financially. The ability to raise money was prohibited by the lack of a national bank for credit for loans. We had expended a great deal of money, and there's nearly $16 million in debt at the time of November of 1814. So there was much for them to complain about and to take issue with. The fact that they would propose amendments to the Constitution and so alter the structure of the government, that would alter the force and weight of the federal government on national issues, and repose in the states more powers to object or to leave the Union or to require greater representations in Congress for declaring war or not. These are matters that I believe were part of those proposals. And I'm saying this rather obscurely. When the convention met in December, it turns out that at the same time the peace commissioners were coming to conclusion with the British and ending of the war. And we also witnessed in Plattsburgh in New York, Lake Champlain, dramatic victories, done on Lake Champlain, and also the effort in repulsing General Prevost with nearly 13,000 men at Plattsburgh. These were dramatic turnabout in the war. And you add to that in January, the news of the late January, the news of the victory at New Orleans. The representatives in the Hartford Convention who brought forward these amendments arrived in Washington City in about mid-February, so, and right at the height of the victories at Lake Champlain and also in Niagara and Plattsburgh, and also followed the great victory of news at New Orleans. The country was exuberant because of the victory in New Orleans. The British lost some 2,500 in killed, wounded, and captured. The United States suffered 6 deaths and 7 wounded in that battle, completely lopsided. And one considers the victories of our frigates at sea, the pronounced victories and one-on-one confrontations, it began to diffuse opposition to the war. So by the time the representatives from Mr. Hillhouse from Hartford arrived with proposed amendments, they sought an audience with me. But the whole city was so excited about the news and the prospects for peace that their efforts to revise the Constitution fell on very deaf ears in Washington City.
Mr. President,
Your name?
I'm Mr. Graham. How do you feel about political parties?
No one likes them, but the reality is that they're inevitable. In establishing a Republican government, we acknowledge that in the large span of the United States that there are numerous conflicting partialities and partisanship interests that are represented in the larger sphere. The more embracing the sphere is in which these conflicting interests take place, then the more protected a minority will be. The reasoning follows that if you have numerous interests in the large nation, that on each issue that is presented before the nation, different elements and factions will gather to either advocate or oppose those national measures. And it's this constantly changing composition of a majority that makes the majority more legitimate and protects the minority. If you have only one group always representing the majority, then tyranny will result. And one group of people will dominate then all the minority and not give them any latitude for representation in the government. We know there are going to be political parties. We know that the majority will always rule in a democratic republic. So the object in the Constitution is to render the nation in a position where so many conflicting interests will never be able to gather sufficient force to constantly be the majority. Rather to have these various associations of interest gather to support one group, another group of interest to advocate another item, and thus the minority will always be outvoted, but the majority will always represent these conflicting interests, and so it may be construed as a more legitimate majority.
Mr. President, I'm Ms. Pardue, and it was my understanding that during the convention of 1787, you were opposed to adding the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, but in 1790 you changed your mind. Why was that?
Well, I was surprised after the convention concluded in September 17th, in 1787, and the Constitution, the report to the Congress was sent to the several states for them to ratify this new Constitution. The Constitution was not effective just because it was written. It had to be ratified by the citizens of the respective states. And each state then was called upon to form a convention to determine whether the Constitution would be accepted or not accepted. And that was the purpose of the ratifying conventions. I did not anticipate the overwhelming objections to a lack of a Bill of Rights in this new proposed Constitution. For one thing, at the time of the convention in 1787, only 8 states of the 13 had any reference to anything that might be construed as a Bill of Rights. They had it either in their own state constitutions or statute law or amendments to their constitutions. Only 8 of the 13. And of those 8, there were none who are in congruence with one another as to what those rights should be within the states. So the expectation of a public outcry for a want of a Bill of Rights in this new government was very surprising. Secondly, it is to be construed if these natural rights, life, liberty, and the right of owning property, as Locke would say, or the right to pursue happiness, as Mr. Jefferson so articulated in the Declaration of Independence, these were more likely to be obstructed by governments of a plenary power, such as the state governments were before the Constitution, than from a national government that had very limited powers, or very specific in what the national government could do. The national government was formed in order to give energy and vitality and authority to a government that would deal with any subject that no one state or group of states could accomplish themselves. So for the dangers to natural rights or citizens' rights would more likely come from the state governments, who had complete powers to do what they wanted to do within their own state, than a national government that was very limited in what its authority would be. So the public outcry for a Bill of Rights was rather surprising to me. It came from curious sources too. There was still a great deal of unsettled feeling amongst the people for want of such a Bill of Rights. As opposed to a Bill of Rights as it was the enumeration of rights which I opposed. Any effort at language to elaborate on a right which you're trying to expand is going to be, by the very nature of language, constricted in its application. So an enumeration of rights would be dangerous. Anything left off such a list would be construed as then being an authority of the national government to address, if it was not listed in such a list of rights. So in preparing, in forming the new government in March and April of 1789, it became apparent to me that if this new government is to be construed as legitimate, the people must be in favor of it. And the people must be in favor of it as it stood, rather than calling for a second convention. But to amend that Constitution, to render it acceptable to the people at large, the subject of a Bill of Rights had to be addressed, and under the Constitution, without any abrogation of the rights or authority of that Constitution. That's a short answer.
Thank you.
Mr. President,
Yes.
I'm Ms. Stacy. How did the War of 1812 establish the U.S. as a nation, and how did the war increase the power of the executive branch as outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution?
Well, the war started in 1812. It finished in February of 1815, so I'm curious why you would say the War of 1812, but perhaps it's just because of the beginning of it. Inherent in any government, in the annals of mankind, it is the executive who is the most likely to advocate a war. It is and because they are the most likely to advocate it, they will be the ones conducting it, and they'll be the ones pursuing it. It is incumbent upon the nation to have the authority to declare war in a different department other than in the executive. It is important to have the finances to conduct a war in the hands of a different branch of government than in the executive branch. The war that has just concluded this past February with the Treaty of Ghent in February of 1815 had some lessons in it, however. One of the major lessons is that the war could be conducted without abridging the Constitution in the conduct of the executive in operating the war and conducting the war. There was never anything done by this administration that would go outside the bounds of authority outlined by the Constitution in the second article of the Constitution. But one of the reflections of the war is that the need for a standing army became a bit more clear. And after the war, after the Treaty of Ghent, and just before the 13th Congress adjourned on the 3rd of March this year, and won't convene, the 14th Congress won't convene until the 2nd of December. What has become clear over the summer is that we need a larger standing army to defend against any incursion in this nation, and not solely depend upon the militia. We have to be careful that the size and breadth of that army and the way it's conducted and the supervision of it. We needed to enlarge the War Department in order to carry on a war and be prepared to carry on a war if necessary. We also had to review the credibility of United States credit abroad for loans at home and abroad to conduct such a war. So that the pecuniary or the monetary matters in operating war had to be revisited, as well as the nature of the size of the army to be revisited, to review it to see whether it's adequate to our needs. And the Navy, certainly providing for an adequate Navy to defend the United States' interests at home and abroad. So in that respect, perhaps the breadth of the scope of the military and the Treasury had to be reviewed rather strongly and corrections made to render the nation more safe. But those corrections had to be done in a constitutional fashion. And there's latitude in the Constitution to make those changes without abridging the Constitution at the same time. And in that respect, I think the war has taught us a great deal. It's also to be remembered that when too much authority is exercised by the executive, there are dangers that will arise. The executive will generally endeavor to advocate a war because any laurels that will be gained by a war will be embracing his brow. He would be enlarged in his authority to make appointments, military appointments and political appointments. He is enlarging his scope of making honorariums, declaring honors upon individuals, rendering increases in emoluments for what people do, the remuneration they get for what they do. And it harbors also a desire to inflate his authority in matters in which he's only touched before, to reach out, to seek other forms of authority, to establish his own authority to higher degrees. It nurses, wars nurse this propensity to increase one's reputation and to increase one's honors and to seek greater power in the nation. And we must be conscious that wars have those internal dangers, notwithstanding the external dangers that might ensue if the war is lost. And so in conducting this administration, I was very anxious not to enlarge the executive authority. That every action taken was done under the guise of the Constitution itself and the Congress, and to register a precedent for later administrations that when in conducting a war, it can be done according to the authority of the Constitution, without changing the authority of the Constitution or the structure of the Constitution of the government.
I wanted to inquire on the title that is sometimes bestowed on you, the Father of the Constitution. How do you regard that? Do you take it with pride, or do you feel that that title should not solely be bestowed upon you?
Well, I appreciate the flattery and the honor accorded to me when that reference is made. But good history reflects that the Constitution in its composition during the convention in 1787 was the work of many heads and many hands. I prepared a report presented by Virginia at the outset of the convention for an outline of subjects that the convention might address. And that was fairly nearly followed to the rest of the convention. But the proposal was also met by other proposals. Mr. Patterson from New Jersey also put forth a plan, and other representatives had put a plan also in mind, and those plans were incorporated into the debates in forming this government. We start from scratch. We have no precedent to follow, no history to follow. We're not in times of war. The haste is not involved in this deliberation in the summer of 1787. And so when an idea is presented, it's done so in private so that there can be a free exercise of opinion, ideas presented before the membership of that convention for their consideration. And some of the ideas are very strong and are eventually adopted. Others are found to be perhaps less applicable or less efficacious in seeking an end. But all these ideas were brought together in a convention in 1787. And each of the members voted on each one of these issues, from the term and length of a congressman to the nature of powers of the Congress, or the structure of the judiciary, the term limits, the emoluments to be given, the orders and responsibilities from one branch to another. All were discussed at length in that convention. And it was the product of those many heads and many hands together that produced the ultimate report on September 17, 1787, that was sent to the Congress in New York under the Articles of Confederation. And under that Congress, under the former Articles of Confederation, that report of the Congress in 1787 was sent to the several states for their ratification or non-ratification. So to suggest that any one individual is more responsible than others may prove rather specious, because the events seem to indicate otherwise.
I'd like to thank President Madison for joining us today. We were definitely blessed to have you here and speak with us so frankly about the current situations.